Welcome to today's discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on security and stability in the Middle East. My name is Yunus Zangiabadi. I am the Executive Vice President of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Today's event is organized in partnership with the Defense and Security Foresight Group, so I would like to thank them for their support and collaboration. We are excited to be presenting this panel as part of our panel series on the impact of COVID-19 on international peace and security. This discussion series is supported by the Department of National Defense, mobilizing insight in defense and security program. So before we dive into the panel introductions, let me briefly introduce our institute. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, is a Canadian nonprofit and nonpartisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement. Through its publications, conferences, policy briefings, and recommendations, IPD will encourage policymakers and leaders in government, civil society, and business communities to adopt a more restrained and open-minded approach in managing the strategic challenges and geopolitical risks of the 21st century. To learn more about us, please visit our website at peacediplomacy.org and follow us on social media. Our goal today is to bring into conversation various perspectives on security interdependence among Middle Eastern countries and explore the opportunities and challenges that the COVID-19 outbreak has created for diplomacy and dialogue in the region. So here's the format to give you an idea of what to expect in the next hour and a half. The discussion is divided into two sections. In the first part, we are honored to have Canada's ambassador to the state of Qatar, Stefanie McCollum, give a keynote speech on Canada's Middle East policy in light of COVID-19, and I'll then have a follow-up discussion with her for about 15 minutes. After that, we will take a 5-minute break before starting the second part of the discussion. I'll use this time to do a quick video and sound check with our panelists to make sure that we can hear and see everybody okay. And we will begin our panel discussion at 11:30 Eastern Time. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Stefanie McCollum, for today's discussion. Stefanie McCollum is a career public servant with experience working in the Department of National Defense, Canadian Armed Forces, and other government departments and agencies before joining the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2005. From 2005 to 2016, she led both the management and consular services programs of Canada in San Francisco, Cairo, Bucharest, and Sao Paulo. In 2016, she returned to Ottawa to serve as Global Affairs Canada's Director of Emergency Operations. In 2017, she acted as the Director of NCO Renewal, which looks to support the management and consular officer community of foreign service professionals in Global Affairs Canada. And in September of 2018, she was appointed Canada's ambassador to the state of Qatar. Ambassador McCollum, thank you again for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Good evening from Doha, everybody. Thank you, Yunus, and to the Institute for Peace and Democracy, and of course the DSF group, for having invited me to speak on the important issue of COVID-19's impact on security and stability in the Middle East. Canada's interests in the Middle East are significant and diverse. There are strong people-to-people ties, commercial interests, political and academic relationships throughout. But as requested this evening or this morning, I will do my best to limit my remarks in particular on Canada's interests and activities related to security and stability in the region, and not just my own area of accreditation here in Qatar, and a little bit about how we've shifted those in light of COVID. So to do that, I'll begin by speaking to Canada's Middle East strategy writ large and how it's evolved since the onset of the pandemic, in particular on humanitarian and the development side, which we feel are key cornerstones to stability in the area. So Canada's current Middle East strategy was launched in 2016 to respond to the ongoing crises in Iraq and Syria and their impact in the region, in particular on Jordan and Lebanon. So under the strategy, Canada committed up to $3.5 billion over 5 years to help set the conditions for security and stability, to alleviate human suffering, enable civilian-led stabilization programs, and support governance and longer-term efforts to build resilience. So if we break down that $3.5 billion, we'll see almost $2 billion in gender-responsive humanitarian assistance and development assistance, $1.3 billion in military assistance and intelligence support, almost $270 million in security and stabilization programming, and just over $90 million to support diplomatic engagement, which is what we do in the embassies in the region. So these whole of government investments target areas where Canada felt our involvement could make a positive difference, where we could leverage Canadian expertise, and where we could complement the efforts of other partners, be it bilateral or multilateral. Our Middle East strategy initially focused on countering and defeating Daesh in Iraq and Syria. And when the global coalition was effective in this mission, it evolved to include a stronger focus on development and stability. So Canada contributes to coalition training, intelligence and stabilization efforts, and remains positioned among the top tier of humanitarian donors, actively engaging with the UN, international organizations, other donors to improve aid effectiveness and delivery of essential support to the most vulnerable conflict-affected populations in the Middle East. So increased levels of such assistance are being provided to many countries in the region, but in particular in Lebanon and Jordan, to deal with massive refugee flows and state fragility, and to help lay the groundwork for stronger and more cohesive communities and governance structures. So we're also actively contributing to international efforts aimed at holding actors accountable for war crimes and violations of international law, finding political solutions to the crises, and support for the rules-based international order, which is, a key value of importance for Canada. We work with the international community on advancing gender equality, support for gender-responsive humanitarian and development assistance, security and stabilization programming, and then, of course, our own diplomatic engagement. So through all these activities and more, Canada and our coalition partners have had real impact. So I'll name just a few examples. Over 7.7 million people and 100% of the territory once held by Daesh in Iraq and Syria have been freed from Daesh's control. Over 19 million square meters of land have been cleared of explosives, allowing displaced persons to return safely home. Security forces in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon have received specialized advice, training, and equipment to detect and address security threats in the region. Canadian humanitarian and development assistance has enabled partners to provide 6 million people with emergency food assistance, as well as gender-sensitive training and financial support to 3,600 public schools in Jordan. In addition, we've helped improve the quality of education for almost 2 million children, including Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. So that's just a really quick bird's eye snapshot of our Middle East strategy from 2016 and into now, 2020. 2020 has been eventful. In January, Canadians around the world mourned the loss of life in the tragic downing of Flight PS 752 in Iran. A few days later, the longest serving ruler in the Arab world, Sultan Qaboos of Oman, passed away. Shortly afterwards, COVID-19 gripped all of our attention, and it still does. More recently, we were jarred by the devastating explosion in Beirut and encouraged by the normalizing of relations between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel. So these events, along with many others I don't have time to mention, shape Canada's activities in the region. But about COVID-19, the pandemic in particular, which had a universal and undiscriminating impact on health systems, economies, and lives around the world, we first looked at it globally before targeting it in particular regions. So globally, Canada provided international assistance to support the humanitarian response. We saw almost 96 million provided to the WHO and other multilateral organizations. 140 million was made available to accelerate vaccine development. 42.5 million for health security capacity building. 20 million to support access to education and child protection services and support the empowerment of women and girls. 20 million to enhance climate risk management and mitigation, and $1 billion as a loan to the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust for interest-free loans to low-income countries and support for the G20 Action Plan for Debt Reduction, given the significant economic impact of the pandemic. Also globally, our multilateral cooperation involves several high-level initiatives led by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Global Affairs or Development, International Trade. Just a few examples would be the Group of Friends of Solidarity for Global Health Security, which is focused on vaccine development and delivery, Ministerial Coordination Group on COVID-19, which looks at the movement of people and goods and strengthening the rules-based systems, and the Development Ministers Contact Group on COVID-19, which looks to ensure we're coordinated and efficient with our humanitarian assistance. So getting back to the Middle East specifically, Canada's response to the pandemic has centered around four major principles: reduced food insecurity, increased water provision and accessibility, increased availability of hygiene supplies, and increased desludging and solid waste management. So we were already an active partner of humanitarian and development organizations active in the region, I just kind of outlined. And we worked with partners such as the World Food Program, UNDP, the Red Cross, and many more. So as our partners pivoted their efforts to respond to the needs created by COVID-19, as did we, either by redirecting or repurposing funding or by providing new funds. So a few examples that I could speak to would be Canada providing $4 million to the World Food Program for their Middle East regional COVID response. In Iraq, Canada contributed $1.85 million to the UNDP to support Iraq's immediate COVID-19 response. And that included things like increasing the testing capacity of laboratories, providing personal protective equipment, PPE, to healthcare workers, increasing the number of beds and isolation wards, etc. In addition, we contributed $1.25 million to Oxfam Quebec and the UN's Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to help prevent the spread of COVID by improving water, sanitation, and hygiene standards. In Jordan, our support included the repurposing of various funds to support their response. For example, via the World Bank for municipalities to provide it again with non-medical PPE and with equipment like fumigators and pumps, via their health fund for refugees in support of the government of Jordan's procurement of critical COVID-19 supplies, anything from testing kits and PPE to equipment including ventilators, which, as you'll recall, at the early onset of the pandemic was a concern for most countries around the world. In Lebanon, as a global concessional funding facility donor, Canada supported repurposing 1/3 of an existing 120 million USD World Bank health sector loan. And that enabled the government of Lebanon to invest in surveillance and case detection, case management, protection of health workers, multi-sectoral operating command centers, and community engagement campaigns, and again, fast-tracking that procurement of critically needed medical equipment and supplies. We also provided $1 million via the UNHCR to address humanitarian needs, in particular in the context of the pandemic and its impact. In Yemen, we allocated $40 million this year to respond to the humanitarian needs of their conflict-affected population that was only aggravated by the pandemic. This funding through UN agencies the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, other NGOs, is helping provide food assistance, healthcare and nutrition support, water, sanitation, hygiene services, protection, shelter, logistical support, and others. So overall, that brings Canada's contribution to over 220 million in humanitarian aid in Yemen since 2015. So that's some of our humanitarian and development support. Of course, in addition to our humanitarian aid, we continue our other activities. So obviously, I was just speaking about Yemen. Our activities there also focus on diplomatic engagement, including actively supporting the efforts of the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, peace and stabilization programming, contributing to UN-led initiatives that support ceasefire agreements and confidence building measures. Those works continue. So these investments in security and stabilization, principally via development and humanitarian support, whether it's focused on COVID response now or support of other priorities that Canada has in the region, which are ongoing, reflect, I think, the importance that Canada places on its relationship with Middle East countries. So I would say before COVID, during COVID, and hopefully we can say after COVID-19, Canada continues to be an active partner in the region towards peace and stability. I think I'm close to running out of time, so let me say in conclusion, while I try to focus briefly on the specific topic at hand, I think it's important to underline that there are more than 1 million Canadians with Arab heritage. Diversity has always been a source of strength in Canada, and is so often the case that strength starts with those people-to-people ties that serve as that societal bridge between Canada and other countries. And so I believe those strong Canadian connections here in the region, coupled with the presence of diaspora communities from the Middle East back home, give Canada an advantage and a very strong interest in security and stability for the region, in particular during this time of COVID. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador McCollum, for this informative and well-articulated remarks on Canada's engagement and investment in the Middle East. Let me now begin by asking you a question about Canada's humanitarian engagement in light of COVID, especially given our political and public health leadership, and by relying on our strong health infrastructure. Does Canada have any plan to provide material and healthcare support to countries in the region that are less equipped to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak? And if so, would that be mainly multilateral or through international organizations and NGOs?
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned, we're already helping, and we do absolutely plan to continue. For the most part, this will be done multilaterally and through NGOs on the ground, who we believe are the best placed to assess the needs and what support is needed most. They really are the experts, and we trust them to work with the funding to maximize and assist as many people as possible. So that includes, as I mentioned, I think, 96 million almost provided to the WHO writ large, and $1 billion to the IMF Poverty Reduction Growth for Trust free loans to low-income countries, including in the Middle East. In addition to those NGOs, Canada also continues to work closely with other countries. So as part of the coordination groups I mentioned earlier, to help with COVID-19 vaccine development and its timely delivery, particularly in vulnerable countries, including here in the Middle East. I would say our support's not limited strictly to those humanitarian or development support that I've spoken to, but can include things like our Trade Commissioner service teams in all of our embassies, helping connect local suppliers with Canadian vendors of medical supplies or equipment, or by connecting our country's medical practitioners to share lessons learned, best practices, to look at joint research, collaboration. So there are a lot of areas by which we do try to help and share Canada's expertise and capacity.
Oh, thank you very much. And do you find this as an opportunity to invest in humanitarian diplomacy and further engage with countries in the region that we do not especially have warm relations with at the moment, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran? has been any development on that front as well?
Well, listen, even pre-COVID, Canada was working alongside the wealthier Gulf states in third countries that were in need of our combined humanitarian support. So those opportunities to engage in parallel humanitarian diplomacy are continuing and evolving now to meet the needs that are brought on by COVID-19. On Saudi, I would say that we have a shared interest in combating COVID-19, and we welcome them leveraging their G20 presidency and convening a number of extraordinary meetings to facilitate a coordinated global response to the pandemic. Speaking to my experience here in Qatar, I can say Canada benefited from humanitarian diplomacy in the work that we did with Qatar and Qatar Airways, who helped Canada repatriate tens of thousands of its citizens from around the world where access was difficult and airports were closed. So while I wasn't directly involved, I know some of my colleagues in the region were also working closely with their host governments and their airlines to facilitate repatriation of our Canadians to Canada. So to me, this is another good example of some humanitarian diplomacy over and above what we've discussed that would be specific development or humanitarian assistance.
Okay. And last question for you, Ambassador, as we bring our conversation to close. In your speech, you characterized Canada's response to pandemic in the Middle East with 4 priorities, one of them being the reduction of food insecurity. You also mentioned that Canada contributed financially to various international organizations that work towards food security in the Middle East. In April, all 6 members of the GCC, including Qatar, agreed to establish a network to protect food supplies. This materialized in the face of the blockade against Qatar that has been in place since 2017 by Saudi Arabia and its partners. Is Canada working with Qatar and other GCC states to capitalize on this opportunity for humanitarian trade and even mediations within the GCC bloc?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. On the GCC initiative, I'll say that agreeing to establish a network to protect food supplies is incredibly relevant, and it's one which Canada applauds and supports. Canada recognizes that international supply chains have been under significant pressure as countries around the world take measures to respond to the pandemic, and keeping these supply chains open is crucial. So that's why Canada, as I mentioned earlier, has been working closely with our international partners at multilateral tables from the G20, chaired this year by Saudi Arabia, to the World Trade Organization and others, to ensure that global supply chains remain open and our businesses can continue their work and that essential goods and services can flow globally. On the aspect of humanitarian trade opportunity for Canada, I think I'll focus on the trade opportunity part since I've spoken a lot to the humanitarian already. So personally, I'm optimistic that this supply agreement does indeed present Canada with some commercial opportunities. The GCC and the broader Middle East is a vast market, which offers significant potential for Canadian companies to do business. To give you an idea, last year, bilateral trade between Canada and the MENA region reached over 15 billion, making the region our 8th most important trading partner. Canada has 4 investment promotion and protection agreements, FIPAs, in the region, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, and Lebanon. Other countries, such as Qatar, are in active negotiations to sign a FIPA with Canada. So in addition to already doing really well in the region, Canadian businesses have an advantage when it comes to the high quality brand we offer, not only in agriculture and agri-food, which would be directly relevant to this food supply chain, but in a multitude of active sectors, renewable energy, life sciences, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, and in energy and infrastructure. Specifically in the Middle East, there are some upcoming opportunities to show off our brand and increase Canadian trade. We've got Expo 2020 in Dubai, which is now in 2021 because of COVID. And of course, the 2022 FIFA World Cup coming up in Qatar. Lastly, on your question about mediation, Canada strives to maintain positive bilateral relationships with all the GCC member states. We're supportive of the mediation efforts undertaken by Kuwait and the US. As I've said, stability in the Middle East and within the GCC is important to Canada, and I hope that the issue between the GCC states will be addressed in a constructive manner. While there was some hope of a rapprochement in late 2019 and early 2020, the onset of COVID and resulting changing domestic priorities have impacted the process. Over the last 2 weeks, though, we have seen some positive signs around mediation efforts, so we remain hopeful and keep encouraging dialogue between all parties.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And there are definitely more questions that I would like to ask, but given our time constraints and also the time difference between Canada and Qatar, I would like to end our conversation here and thank you again, Ambassador, for joining us today for this timely discussion on the Middle East in these unprecedented times.
My pleasure. Thank you so much again for the invitation.
For sure. And so let's now take our 5-minute break before. So welcome back, everyone, and thank you for staying with us for the second segment of our event. We have a distinguished panel of experts joining us today from Qatar, the UK, France, and Canada to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on security and stability in the Middle East. For this section, I'll be very brief, so I will only introduce our great moderator, who will be then taking over and facilitate the discussion to the end. It's an honor to introduce our moderator for today's panel discussion, Sanam Chantier. Sanam is a senior journalist at France 24 and the host and co-editor of weekly flagship program, Middle East Matters. She has previously worked for Reuters and AFP. During her 7-year tenure at Reuters, she set up and ran the agency's news operation in Tehran. She's been now covering the region for over 16 years. Sanam, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to moderate this important panel discussion today. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Firstly, I'd like to say a very good evening to you all from Paris, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual panel, which is, of course, brought to you by the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Now, I'm personally very much looking forward to moderating this panel, which will focus on a region that's close to all of our hearts here. And I hope everyone will find this exchange as insightful as I'm sure I will. Now, as you know, the topic of the discussion is the impact of COVID-19 on security and stability in the Middle East at a time when we know the region is grappling with health hazards, exacerbated security dilemmas, a devastating economic recession, a shift in geopolitics, human rights violations, and I think, frankly, the list could really go on and on, so I'll stop there. And we're extremely fortunate this Thursday to be joined by some of the best voices, if I may say so myself. We're talking about experts and diplomats alike, and hopefully we'll be speaking over the next hour. So I'd like to take the time to welcome each and every one of our panelists one by one. I'm going to start by presenting Dennis Horak, Canada's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He joined the Canadian Department of External Affairs in 1987, and he has since had a plethora of positions in Stockholm, Warsaw, and Tehran, etc. He finally assumed the role of Canada's ambassador to Saudi Arabia in July 2015, where he'd actually previously acted as the mission's political economic program manager. Thanks so much for being with us, sir. Up next, we have Dr. Bessma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Dr. Momani has authored and co-edited 10 books and over 80 scholarly papers, which have examined everything from international affairs to diversity and inclusion, and of course, Middle Eastern affairs. Dr. Momani, it's wonderful to have you on board.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the third panelist. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I've been practicing this. Luciano Zaccara, a professor in Gulf politics at Qatar University. Dr. Luciano Zaccara is also a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar and the director of OPEMMA in Spain. His research specializes in Iranian politics, Persian Gulf politics, international relations in the Persian Gulf, and electoral systems in the Middle East and North Africa. Professor, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Rothna Begum, a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, with a focus on, of course, the Middle East and North Africa. She's an expert researcher and campaigner on an impressive array of regional human rights issues such as freedom of expression, counterterrorism, women's rights, refugees and migrants, corporal punishment, and the death penalty. Rothna, thank you so much for joining us. Now, before we start, Eunice and I had a very brief conversation. I would love for this discussion to be as dynamic as possible. So even if I address it to you, please at some point, if you want to contribute, signal to me and I'll come to you. I just want this to be a discussion as opposed to mini addresses and speeches. And of course, we're open to disagreements if we have them. So let's start the panel discussion. And I'm going to start with a zinger, with the actual title of the panel that brings us here today. And this is to Dennis Horak. We'll start with you if we may. Can you tell us, and this could go on forever, but we'll try and keep it as limited as we can. What are in your opinion, the likely short and long-term impacts of the pandemic? So both on security and stability in the Middle East.
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's a question that we're asking about the entire world, in fact, even including our own homes, our own cities. I think the short answer is I don't think anybody really knows. My best guess would be that as we move out, and if there is indeed a post-COVID world, we'll probably revert back to the way things were. I know people have been predicting all sorts of massive changes, and this is going to change people's perspectives and create a much more sort of globalist idea that we're all in this together, we're all on this planet, we're all facing the same sorts of challenges. That would be nice, but we've already seen, even during COVID, various countries sort of trying to protect their own interests, trying to, secure, whether it's vaccines or treatments or ventilators or whatever it might be, sort of a much more cutthroat sort of an approach, rather than sort of this, everybody hug each other kind of idea. And I think that will certainly apply, I think, as equally as well in the Middle East, in the Gulf. I mean, we've seen some cooperation in certain areas, and it's transactional very much, but I don't think the fundamental issues, the fundamental perspectives are going to change coming out of COVID, or, if it continues on as it is, I think we'll still see some of that. I don't foresee many drastic changes in terms of overall perspectives.
Bessma, Momani, I'm going to come to you next. We just heard from Dennis Horak there saying that we may not see any fundamental changes. Do you perceive any geopolitical changes, certainly in the landscape of the Middle East, in light of COVID-19?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to agree with Dennis in many ways. I think, and I say afraid because it's a pessimistic tone. Let's be honest, we all want there to be more cooperation, more interdependencies, but I really do feel that we're seeing a shift. And I would also point out that we saw the beginning of this from before, the rise of nationalism, the rise of social and political polarization. I think the economic reality is it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for every country with the fiscal space narrowing. So frankly, all those make it even more difficult for there to be more cooperation and inclusivity. And so we're going to see, I think, throughout not just the Middle East, it is a global challenge where this reversion to introverted social and political and economic policies is going to make things tougher. And so I think the rise of nationalism is evident throughout the Middle East. It is, a competitive world. If we think about the fact that we're all scrambling to get, as Dennis kind of pointed out, the PPEs, the personal protective equipment, we're going to see the same in terms of, supporting one's domestic constituents. So that era of cooperation, of partnership, of unity, I think we're going to see cutthroat competition. And I think it's a real shame because, of course, when that happens, all of the investment in the things that we had been working towards, from inclusive governance to, broad-based political negotiations with groups and people, all of that goes to the wayside. So we really have to, I think, prepare ourselves for a turbulent time, whether we're in the West or in the Middle East.
Not very optimistic language there, I'm afraid. No fundamental changes, cutthroat competition. So would it be naive, and I throw this to the floor, whoever wants to take it, would it be naive to say that when dealing with the conflicts in the region, from Syria to Yemen to Iraq, where we know that regional proxies are at war with each other, that this pandemic, most likely, it hasn't up until this point, and it won't bring about an opportunity for dialogue? Who would like to take that?
If I have to be the optimistic one, I'm not the one. I think, I mean, I more or less, I agree with what my colleague said at the beginning. I mean, we were optimistic at the very beginning of this pandemic because we realized that this would last long, and actually it happened what we all thought about, that the COVID would extend to the whole world without any possibility to contend it in one country or one continent. Even it reached places in which, as you said, I mean, they are under conflict. We had the expectation that this would change the way in which states, governments, groups would deal with that, but unfortunately, I don't see that. And actually, the solidarity and the empathy that existed in other places in which there were no conflicts lasted 1 month, 1.5 months, 2 months in the best cases. So again, as Dennis mentioned, I mean, most of the states started to think about their own interest. And this is what it was visible in terms of dealing with the already existing conflicts. And I think if it did something, unfortunately, is to accelerate arrangement in terms of security, which were based on the old way of understanding security, the hardcore security, to make sure that borders are protected enough to prevent the incoming people that it was infected. I mean, most of the states, they started to understand their security in terms of hardcore security. And I think this is, of course, this is not helping to solve the conflict that they already exist in the region.
If that was the optimistic view, then I hate to hear the pessimistic. I do want to zoom out, if we can, a little bit, because we've been talking about the conflicts in the region, and it's impossible to ignore the role of greater powers. Bessma, I'm going to come back to you for this question. Would you say that, or are we going to stick to the no fundamental changes? Would you say that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the nature of the strategic competition that we're seeing from these external powers in the region? So we're talking specifically about the US and the West, and of course Russia and China, all of these who have very significant roles in the region that we're speaking about, the Middle East.
That's a great question. You know, I mean, there's a couple of things to unpack there, because look, when you have such constricted fiscal space, every country is trying to do more with less. This crisis is going to, I think, hurt every country across the globe economically. That is, it's not just because being a political economist, I focus on that, but you have to start with that premise. And you have high expectations among a young population in the Middle East. They want to see, jobs. They want to see their socioeconomic position improve. And the government, I think, in many cases, most governments in the region couldn't provide that adequately before the crisis, and now you add the crisis. So there's an internal, I think, situation where there is going to be a lot of social stability challenges. And frankly, the governments in many cases and throughout the country, throughout the region, haven't done a good job in building public trust. You know, this public health crisis requires investment in public trust, in getting people's confidence in the government. In fact, what we've seen, into old tactics of using a securitized language when it comes to COVID, rather than saying building of that public trust and health experts and explain how this works. And so for many people, I have to point out, on the ground, they see governments who are taking advantage of a health crisis to basically securitize the space even more, be more repressive, clamp down on free speech and free thought, all I think which is counterintuitive in the long run. You can't fight this crisis by just trying to control a narrative. In this world of, free, the fact that we have, globalized communication technology just makes it almost impossible. Even firewalls in China, with all the state investment, can't stop people from having these kinds of conversations. So governments in the Middle East have to up to the reality that their population is educated, their population is increasingly cosmopolitan and global in outlook, and they want to be not told what to do, they want to be informed educated along with the best experts and health scientists that they have. So the entire approach of so much of these countries is problematic. But then now you talk about the external dynamics, and I'm sorry if I'm hogging the mic, but it's really important to talk about both the domestic security space and the external. And we know that too often in the region, there is an excuse for domestic failures by distraction on the geopolitical, on the regional. And so it also becomes an opportune time for so many of these governments to indeed shift focus to foreign policy, to regional aspects. That is also problematic when we need to get this, this virus under control. Last but not least, you talked about great power rivalry or external intervention. The lack of external intervention might be a good thing, right? We can't also assume implicit in that message is somehow, if the West isn't paying attention, the Middle East is going to go amok. Maybe sometimes we don't need the Americans to pay attention to the Middle East so that, the Middle East can actually do things on their own. But the challenge there is that these are also governments that are not necessarily always using the best interest of their people in the long run. Survival, they want to stay in power, and staying in power can be really useful when you divert attention to regional and security challenges outside, but focusing within the country.
One thing I think will be interesting to watch in terms of the role of external powers going forward is the leveraging of, let's call it vaccine diplomacy. You've got the Russians who've supposedly developed a vaccine, the Chinese maybe as well, the Americans will. Will they be using access to vaccines to sort of leverage additional power, additional influence? It sounds pathetic, but it's entirely possible in today's world. So I think that's something. The other thing is, I think COVID has exacerbated xenophobic tendencies and attitudes, I think, across the Gulf in particularly with regards to migrant workers in the region, but perhaps even it may towards Chinese, Russians, whomever, Iranians. We've seen it around the world, and it already had a very strong foundation in the region. So I think those are two things looking forward.
So both Dennis and Bessma have spoken about certain players trying to take advantage of this crisis, about the xenophobic tendencies increasing, and I think that nicely brings us to the next topic. And for this, I'd like to finally, and thank you for your patience, bring in Rothna. Rothna, we know that this is a time when many countries across the globe, not just the Middle East, they're having to take very special measures to deal with these really unprecedented scenarios. We are doing the same here in France, but there are concerns, and this is coming from rights groups certainly, that some of these steps can and will, when it comes to the Middle East specifically, infringe on human rights. Can you talk us through that?
Certainly. Thanks again for this discussion. I think it's an incredibly important one. And human rights really is at the crux of when we talk about security and stability in the Middle East. And what we've really seen with the pandemic is an exacerbation of all of the pre-existing issues we've had from before, whether it was a conflict, whether it's migrant workers' rights, or whether it comes to women's rights and domestic violence. So what we're really seeing is a whole host of issues in which the government could be doing more in terms of actually trying to really impact the lives of its citizens and its residents, but they're really failing in doing so. I mean, we're talking about the right to health, of course, and the right to life. That's the core value, core issues. But there's also various other problems that are occurring as well. So, for instance, in terms of three key issues, I would like to really talk about how things have been exacerbated. So, firstly, COVID-19 is having an impact on specific populations. It does discriminate in terms of the kinds of impacts it has on particular populations, like, for instance, the refugee and displaced groups, but also overcrowded prison populations. The Middle East has a huge numbers of prisoners, many of whom shouldn't even be there because they're political prisoners. And while governments have tried to alleviate some of that, but many of them have not come through in terms of releasing prisoners. Saudi Arabia, for instance, continues to hold many political prisoners, including women's rights activists. Even with the fact that it's holding the G20 in 2 months, they still haven't released at least 5 women's rights defenders who have been complaining about the impact on their health. The other two key issues are around migrant workers, which has already been raised, in which we've now seen, because of the economic crisis, a number of workers have been dismissed from their jobs. They're facing unpaid wages. These are all issues that have already existed from before, but just exacerbated. And a large number of workers are now in a situation where they're wanting to return home, but not able to, or being forced to return home with unpaid wages. And last but not least, we've got what's being termed as the silent pandemic. And this is really about violence against women, on domestic violence. So COVID-19 has led to restrictions, including lockdowns and confinement to households. But what that really means for women who are facing abusive family members, or domestic workers who are facing abusive employment conditions, is that that home is now an incredibly abusive environment. And the Middle East has really lagged behind other governments in both taking measures to protect women from such violence, but to take particular measures to actually protect them from this time as well. So those are some of the particularly prominent issues that have come to the fore as a result of the pandemic.
Rothna, you've just brought to the table several prominent issues that we've been faced with during this health crisis. What's the solution? How can some of these violations be monitored and tackled actually across the region?
Sure. Well, when it comes to something like violence against women and domestic violence, or abuse against migrant domestic workers, there's some very clear steps that the governments could be taking. That includes hotlines, includes making sure there's safe shelter available. There's lots of creative solutions out there, including hotels, that the government could be using. They're not, but they could be. Tunisia is actually a good example, which has sort of put on a hotline for domestic violence victims to call. But many other governments are failing to really provide for campaigns to allow women to be able to call, to be able to know that there is a zero tolerance for such forms of violence. When it comes to migrant workers, there were clear things that the government could be doing. Initially, some governments said that they want to ensure that there's medical treatment for all migrant workers, because what's clear is that you want to make sure that no one is actually contracting coronavirus 19, and that includes migrant workers. In certain places, this is becoming a lot more widespread. But instead, what we've seen is they're not tackling the root causes or the issues around which workers end up facing these problems. So those are overcrowded conditions in labor camps. They need to be alleviating those. They also need to be ensuring that the power imbalances that exist need to be dealt with, which is the kafala visa sponsorship system, so that workers are able to come and get access to medical treatment. They're able to get themselves regularized. Those kind of issues are really important. The safe repatriation is like the key priority right now for migrant workers. And finally, overcrowded prison populations, it's something that they should be doing right now, releasing political prisoners that they should not be holding in the first place. And in terms of like people who have committed low or minor infractions, they could be considering how to reduce those prison populations. I think just on one positive note, because we've been talking in a very negative way, the COVID-19 pandemic, while it has exacerbated all of these issues, it's also highlighted how incredibly important it is that we ensure the safety of everyone. If we don't, none of us are safe. And so it now propped up alternative visions of what society could look like, which we haven't been able to really push forward before. Now governments have an opportunity to try and do things a bit differently.
An opportunity to do things differently. When we're talking about human rights, it's impossible to dismiss sanctions, punitive measures, blockades. And so when it comes to the region, we're talking about countries like Qatar, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories. Certainly, it goes without saying, and I've been reporting on this consistently since the beginning of the pandemic, their fight against this global crisis has been impeded because of these obstacles that they face. And for this, I'd like to bring in Professor Zaccara, if I may, because of your speciality when it comes to certainly Iranian affairs. Where are we at? What can the international community do, which it really hasn't done up until this stage, to help the civilians? You're on mute at the moment. I may ask you to take you off. There we go.
Sorry. Well, this is a difficult question. I wish I can have the right answer to do that. But I mean, this is what I was trying to say at the beginning, that it seems that we didn't learn anything from that. What Rothna brilliantly explained is that if the governments, they don't change the way to approach these security issues in a way that is not related to hardcore security, but human security, in the sense of the most important capital that every state has is their people. And mainly countries that they rely heavily on workers. I mean, if they don't do anything to protect these people, the country will collapse. The economy will collapse, but the country itself will collapse. And these cases that you mentioned previously, sanctions, blockades, etc., they are targeting people. And of course, it's not the same blockade against Qatar, that is a resourceful country that actually is blocked by other 3 countries of the GCC, but actually Qatar didn't lose any contact with the United States, Russia, China, the rest of the world is still connected to Qatar. So you cannot see really the impact of the blockade here. But in Iran, yes, of course, in Iran, yes, you can feel the impact. And actually, I mean, visiting Iran many times in the last years, moreover since Trump reimposed the sanctions, you could see that civil society or the economy was trying to survive, to keep up with the economy. Iran is a country that has been under sanctions since 1979, so they know how it is to live under sanctions, mainly after 2006 when they imposed the most heavier sanctions by the United Nations Security Council. So they thought that they could cope with that. What happened? But the COVID was absolutely something unexpected. And the impact of COVID in the whole Iranian economy, in closing all the land borders, in closing almost all the air connection with other countries, countries like China, they were keeping up with buying some oil, they stopped buying absolutely oil. Of course, this was something that Iran was not able to deal with, despite all the efforts that they made. And the people that this affected is mainly people. So sanctions combined with COVID are affecting the Iranian population more than ever before. What can be done? Of course, first of all, they need to think about people and not sanctioning the Iranian government. But we realize that this is not, I mean, not everybody is on the same page, while the European Union is stating very clearly that, I mean, the sanctions, the American sanctions are not fair and they should be, well, you know, all the things that we are discussing about the JCPOA. The American government decided that targeting the Iranian government is the right thing to do, despite the fact that this is affecting really the people, and that the people is suffering for something that was not planned, and nobody, I mean, we cannot blame anybody because of the expansion of the COVID. But I don't think we learned the lesson, and this is, I think this is the most, the biggest preoccupation we have nowadays in the region.
And of course, you know, the Iranians are not alone. We've been doing a lot of reporting from Gaza since the beginning of the pandemic, where they're facing a huge humanitarian crisis. There's not they don't have punitive measures, but it's a blockade. So they're unable to bring in medical equipment, food. They have no electricity throughout the day. It's impossible to socially distance because of the small spaces. And another country that has been slapped with a blockade, Dennis Horak, of course, is Qatar. We see, and I want to talk to you about the diplomatic perspective here. We see that the US administration is in a diplomatic drive. Donald Trump wants to get every deal done possible prior to that all-important vote coming up in November. I was just in the UAE covering the US-Israel so-called peace normalization agreement, if you like. They're now saying they're very keen to end the Qatar blockade, not necessarily because of COVID-19, but as part of this, under this diplomatic umbrella, if you like. Do you see that happening in the coming weeks as it's been pledged?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think certainly the Trump administration is focusing very much on trying to demonstrate its capabilities on the diplomatic front, and I don't know whether it's about getting a Nobel Peace Prize or whatever. Certainly the deals with Bahrain and the UAE are aimed at very much at the American evangelical community to try and get a sense of, you know, that look at what we've done for Israel, quote unquote. And, you know, the Qatar issue, yeah, I think they would like to get that resolved. I mean, the U.S. is sort of betwixt and between on the various parties. You know, they have the base in Qatar, they have strong relations with the UAE and with Saudi. And they would certainly want another victory to sort of show that Trump is this wonderful wonderful diplomat. The U.S. is a very constructive role in the world. It doesn't garner them a lot of votes. Americans don't vote on foreign policy, and they certainly won't this year. But I think they'll try. I don't know if the Americans can be any more successful than anybody else has tried to, whether it's the Kuwaitis or whatever, and trying to try and bridge these differences, which frankly I still don't understand. But we'll see.
We'll see. Cautious there. Bessma, anything to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that assessment. I mean, look, it's even hard to call this, I mean, normalization deal, yep, I guess, and certainly not a peace deal. These countries have never had a direct conflict with each other. And, you know, as much as the Israelis may want to try, you know, you can do all the deals with all the countries in the world. If you don't deal with the Palestinians, you're not going to actually have true and genuine peace. So it's a diversion tactic from Netanyahu's failed approach to handling the coronavirus, to his numerous corruption charges, and him really hanging on by a thread in terms of his coalition. So it's I think a distraction, you know, from domestic troubles. I guess, you know, the big issue, and we kind of discussed a little bit in terms of, you know, just how this virus is going to affect so many places. But look, it feeds off of places that are dense. It feeds off of places that are poor. You know, Rothna talked about all of the vulnerable communities. Absolutely. And I'm just going to add one more: informal workers. There are so many people in the region who are day laborers. They have no choice to lock down, to stay home and follow public advice. That's the reality. And this is, you know, whether we're talking about it in the West in terms of precarious worker, gig workers, so many racialized and women particularly who are forced into the service industry to just pay their daily expenses. We have similar kind of precariousness in and throughout the Middle East. Obviously, migrant workers are at the top of that, but we go beyond that in places like Egypt, where vast number of the population are informal workers. They have no choice. Iran, similarly, so many informal workers. There is no choice, and there's no confidence in government. I mean, I can't reiterate this enough. You know, you need to have confidence in your public health authorities. You need to have confidence when they're telling you to stay home or follow the advice of social distancing. You're doing it for because you trust your government. I mean, I have to say, as a Canadian, I trust my public health officials. When they tell me time to put your mask on going indoors, I will do it. There's no trust in the Middle East for so many of these governments. Even in places that are doing well in socioeconomic terms, you still kind of dig deep. Do you trust your government to tell you the truth? Essence. I mean, it really is a core principle. And so that is a real challenge. And I think we are really in a situation, and again, the United States, certainly most people don't trust their federal government. So, you know, let's not look too far. Here in Canada, we don't have to look all the way to the Middle East to find where there are governance challenges and failures.
Rothna, I want to briefly come back to you, if I may. Is it too naive to start believing in at least humanitarian diplomacy with countries like Canada, for example, who may be able to take on more of a mediating role when it comes to the Middle East?
I think Canada is well positioned actually to mediate, but also in order to try and get governments to push on them to really take on some of these measures. Some of the issues that we're talking about, for instance, whether it's the G20 coming up in Saudi Arabia, trying to get Saudi Arabia to come through on a number of terrible violations that they're committing, whether it's political prisoners and people still held. I mean, those are very immediate things that they could easily come through on if they wanted to, but also in terms of the war in Yemen and what's happening there. And then in other kind of countries where, you know, there are a number of different contexts going on, whether it's migrant workers, domestic violence, these are issues in which the government can take clear steps. It's about the political will to actually do those issues, to actually take those steps. In other circumstances, of course, you know, we're talking about, for instance, Lebanon with the Beirut port explosion. One big issue that's coming up is aid. So there's a lot of pledges being made by a number of governments to say that they want to aid to deal with Lebanon, and it's not just its economic crisis, but now with the port explosion, it's having huge impact on society. And what we've been saying is that they should be looking as donors to be giving it to an independent fund, because the government, as you know, Bessma just articulated, these governments, there's no trust in them to do anything. And what we've seen with the Lebanese government is that they have failed to really provide for the rights to food, health, and housing for their own citizens. And with aid coming into the country to really try to rebuild Beirut, for instance, and as they move forward to the economy, they need to be able to do so in a manner that the citizens themselves are able to trust and the residents are able to trust. And that means doing so with the civil society in an independent manner. The citizens right now do not trust the government to actually be able to deal with this humanitarian crisis because the government hasn't been doing it for the last few weeks. What we've seen so far is civil society really picking up the whole bits and clearing the streets of Beirut and trying to deal with this scenario. And when international aid comes flowing through, it should be them who's a part of the remaking all of this as well.
Thank you for that, Rothna. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just coming to the question of whether Canada would be in a position to mediate some of the challenges and conflicts that are in the region. I do come to the point that Rothna made about will. I don't think the will exists for the large part. I don't know that Canada really has a Middle East policy per se. I think that it's very much an aid policy that's regionalized. We can certainly make contributions to various initiatives, whether it's in refugee issues in Lebanon and Jordan, etc., as we've done in the past. But I don't think there's a will to really politically engage in the region because I don't know the government, A, has an interest in it, and B, is willing to devote the kind of political effort that you need to do that. And C, we're not well positioned with some of the key players, be that Iran, be that Saudi Arabia, which is involved in a number of these conflicts, and we're not positioned with them at all. So our capability, I think, is also undermined.
It's interesting that you say Canada's capability is undermined. It also happens to have somewhat soured relations with Tehran and Riyadh, so may not even be in a position to
that's what I meant. That the capability isn't there because of our weak standing with the two key players in the region, the Saudis and the Iranians. We're not present at all in Iran, and we are playing shorthanded in Riyadh. So, and we're not in a good position as a result.
Professor Zaccara, let's come to you on the Iran angle again.
Mm-hmm. Which specifically, because I was thinking on the other question that I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, think about the other question. What's the other question that you respond to?
About the Qatar blockade and about, following up with what Dennis said, who is interested in mediating, in solving the problems here in the GCC? We can see that Trump is exerting a lot of pressure on the GCC states to sign normalization with Israel, and this is a priority for Trump to finish his term. But in the last 3 years, I didn't see any priority in solving a diplomatic issue within the GCC context that, for me, would be much easier to solve than recognizing or normalizing with Israel, which is a conflict that lasted for more than 50, 70 years, or even between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that they are long-term conflict that will take a lot of time to solve. So my question is, what is the priority of the United States, which seems to be the only country able to push other states or to pressure other states with enough resources to get what they want? They were able to force so far, or to get, not force, but to persuade two countries to normalize with Israel, but they were not able to end a blockade with the country in which the United States has the biggest base in the whole Middle East. So of course there is no political will, there is no interest, and the interests of the United States are elsewhere. The problem is that then you see, recently United States declared Al Jazeera as a foreign agent. So this is a way to give signals to Qatar on which way they should go in order to end this blockade. I think they are going in the wrong direction. I don't see this as a show of goodwill to facilitate any conflict resolution in the region, which means that maybe this blockade will last forever, maybe not forever, but for long term, because nobody, neither in the region nor outside, is pushing for this to happen. So what are the chances that other conflicts, like the big gap that exists between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that almost brought us to an open war in several occasions, can be solved? And this is where I am pessimistic. We had this opportunity that could have solved some issues could have eased the tension. We saw some reapproachment between Emirates and Iran, but nothing else. I'm sorry to be the pessimistic one, but here.
No, everyone's pessimistic. It's absolutely fine. We're all on the same page. We're all nodding in agreement.
That's what COVID does. It makes everybody pessimistic.
COVID and the Middle East, sadly, coupled together. I'm going to bring in Rothna now, not necessarily for optimism, but just for the sakes of acknowledging the humanitarian angle again. Rothna, we've been hearing quite consistently along the panel that Canada currently doesn't have consistent foreign policy, strategic policy, certainly when it comes to the Middle East. Diplomatically, it's in a very difficult position to do so. What about offering a helping hand, specifically during the pandemic, when it comes to the humanitarian issues?
I mean, I think it's just looking at the context, right? So in the case of Lebanon, as I sort of outlined, it's not just about giving international aid, it's about how you give that aid and the way in which that's done. So it actually gets to the right people.
And that's a question. I'm going to interrupt you because a lot of, as you know, rights groups, civil society organizations, they're all concerned about how it's being filtered into the country, because oftentimes it has been taken advantage of and it's been taken away from the people that need it most. How does the international community, how do international organizations monitor that?
Well, I think that can be done. And what we're really calling for is for the international donors, as they're sort of talking about pledging, that they insist on an independent fund that is transparent in the way that the funds are then dispersed, and that civil society, local civil society, then play a role in the way that fund is managed. And that would then build trust in terms of how that money is coming through and what is happening with that money. And also ensuring that there is no discrimination or in terms of disproportionate impact of the way those funds are dispersed. Because of the Lebanon system of the way it's sectarian and the way it has over the years really been discriminating against who it's actually giving money to and who's able to benefit out of that through the corruption that exists in the system. And so we really do need to look at how it is actually done. The other issue I just want to raise in terms of Iran, when you referred to earlier about the economic sanctions. So we at Human Rights Watch have actually documented how the incredibly harsh economic sanctions on Iran is having an impact on Iran being able to deal with COVID-19 in order to be able to get medical supplies as well as equipment. And doctors and health officials themselves are saying that this is having an impact. And really what the US needs to do and what allies to the US need to do is to really push them on actually lifting those sanctions, or to ensure that they are licenses, they grant more exceptions to the licenses so that Iran is able to procure what it needs in order to be able to fight COVID-19. One of the key issues around this, and we've sort of talked about the fact that there's been a failure, there's been an opportunity to really cooperate, but a number of states have failed to really cooperate with each other. But like in a state where you have to make sure everyone is protected, in the same way globally, we need to make sure every single country is not losing out to COVID-19, because we're all going to be unsafe. We cannot completely have travel restrictions for the rest of our lives. We need to ensure that every country has managed to fight and contain COVID-19 so that we are able to go back, not to a normality that existed before, because what we had before wasn't okay, but to a future in which we're COVID-19 free, but a society that's also in a much better place as well.
Really interesting insights there. Bessma, I want to bring you back in if I may, because up until this point, I think, if you might agree, the focus of the discussion of the panel has been diplomacy, the humanitarian element, somewhat the economy. I want to talk to you specifically about security, terrorism in the region, how that's been impacted, if in any way at all, during this pandemic.
Well, I've always been of the belief that there has been overemphasis and over-discussion about terrorism in the region, in some way as a distraction to so many other things happening. And I don't want to really pile on to that, but to take your question and to be very, to be able to answer it, I'll just have to kind of preface it with that, because I do think that it's not the only issue that the average Middle Easterner is facing. A lot of challenges, including socioeconomic ones, certainly COVID today, and including oppression and repression by their own governments. And terrorism is actually not top of mind. But to take your question to heart, which I really appreciate, look, there has been, some would argue, a resurgence of ISIS. Certainly they've been regrouping, and so there's new activity. That obviously is very, very concerning. But I think also much of the security sector has been being built up over the years. Some of it good. I think that there's been, for example, building a professional national army in Iraq, something that the ambassador alluded to. The Canadians have been very much involved with. Certainly in the case of Lebanon as well, our investment in Lebanese armed forces have all been good, because in many ways, for those countries where if you don't have a competent professional, very important, professional national army, you introduce the space for basically warlords to basically create their own little fiefdoms. And that's worse for places like Lebanon or Iraq. So I think that's a really key distinction. But, I do also want to point out that I think we're all becoming far more introverted, and know that part of that means that we're also creating all these new social cleavages. So polarization is something that's happening in every country, in my humble opinion. The rise of white supremacists in the United States is a huge security concern. Now, basically seem to be far more potent to the security of Americans than perhaps any ISIS, Al-Qaeda terrorist is. So that's really important. I think for the Middle East, that polarization is really dangerous. And I think we are going to see governments use, in many ways, polarization to their own advantage. And that is not good in places where there's high sectarianism, there's high ethno-national divisions and identities. And so I think it's something to be mindful of. And again, it's back to that point that I started off with, which is distraction. And governments that focus on that mantra of being security heavy either want to convince people that the security threat is out there and everything here is great, if only we could stop the nemesis from the outside, or they start to find enemies from within. That's the sort of the story of so much of politics, unfortunately, and that really frightens me, because there are cleavages in society that are ethnic, that are sectarian, that are regional, and I would really think that for those of us who analyze the region, to keep mindfulness of what kinds of trends we see in the region coming. So insecurity may be also within, and not just necessarily regional or terrorism.
Dennis Horak, I'm going to now shift to the questions that we're getting from some of our viewers, and it comes at a really timely moment, given that we've just been speaking to Bessma about sectarianism, proxy conflicts in the region. And this is a question to you. A recent UN report indicated that Canada's arms sales to Saudi Arabia is, quote, helping to perpetuate the conflict in Yemen. Don't need a quote for that. We know that as a fact. The UN has thus called on states, spelling mistake there, sorry, to reiterate to stop transferring arms to the parties to the conflict. What are your thoughts on this? This is from a viewer. We don't have a name, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It is a tricky issue. I mean, there's a couple of issues here. I mean, first of all, the arms that Canada has been sending has largely been to one entity, and it's on border protection. It's to the National Guard, to whom we've been selling for decades. And it really comes down to the fundamental question of, do you want to have an arms industry or not? And if you have an arms industry and you agree to that, then you have to understand that these things are going to be used, and they're going to be used in a war. And yes, any armament you give to a country at war is going to contribute to its ability to carry out that war. That is true. But there are different classes of weapons that are involved in Iran in Yemen, and certainly I think that the air component has been by far the largest contributor to the humanitarian disaster there. And to my knowledge, it may have changed, but to my knowledge, most of the weapon systems that Canada has been providing have been used on the border. And there have been skirmishes across the border. There have been arms that have been fired into Saudi Arabia. So if you sell weapons to a country and they're using it to the National Guard and they're using it to defend their territory, that's the reason for which you sold them. The other element, of course, is we have a contractual obligation. We entered into a contract. The contract has not been violated to my knowledge, and that creates real challenges for a country like Canada that has sold arms on the basis of elements of a contract. So it's a tricky situation to be sure.
Rothna, how does that make you feel? A contractual obligation, the cost of which is the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. This is for Rothna. Dennis, Horak,
Yeah,
will come
fine.
back. No, we have to be a little bit controversial here and tackle the difficult issues. Rothna, this one's yours, my dear.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say there's an international obligation on states to ensure that their arms that they do sell are not used to commit human rights violations or violations against the laws of war, which of course Canada is required to monitor and ensure that it does not, including like whether it's contractually obligated to before or not, to continue to provide those arms and those weapons. We have, as Human Rights Watch, documented the ways in which Saudi Arabia and the UAE and its coalition have actually committed a number of violations in Yemen over the course of the last 5 years, and continuing to do so in committing those laws of war, violations against the laws of war. And we want to see those arms sales transfers to come to an end. It is one of the reasons for why we have one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. COVID-19 has exacerbated all of those issues, and Yemen and the Yemenis are facing a terrible disaster right now. And one of the least things that states could be doing right now is to say that they are not going to pursue selling or processing arms transfers to the states that have been engaged in the war in Yemen. So I think that would be a great step for Canada to make right now, and it would at least put us in a position of seeing a war that has been going on for far too long to come to an end.
I guess I just wanted to clarify. When I said there were contractual obligations, part of those contractual obligations in any Canadian arms contract is subject to export controls and export controls related to violations of human rights. And to my knowledge, up until when I was involved with it, the weapons systems we were providing to Saudi Arabia were not being used to violate human rights. So that's what I meant. Obviously that's part of the contract, but so certainly I'm not saying, well, we have a contract, so forget about human rights violations or international humanitarian law. We did monitor them. We do monitor. Canada does do that. So and when there's clear evidence that the weapons that Canada has provided have been used to violate human rights, well, then that provides there's a contractual out, if you will, that's embedded into these contracts. But if that evidence isn't there, that Canadian weapons have been used to violate international human rights, it creates a whole different situation for Canada. That's what I meant. Not that, well, we have a contract and we have to do it.
Thank you for clarifying that, Dennis. Rothna was just saying, this is a good opportunity for Canada to do something right, and may have changed his words a little bit. I'm not sure exactly what you said verbatim, but I want to pick that phrase up and put it in another scenario, and this is for both Luciano and Bessma, if I can. And this comes from another viewer. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif to discuss the issues around the downing of that civilian airplane. I think that was certainly for most Iranians one of the most difficult moments that we've had this year. They were discussing everything from the investigation to transparency, compensation, and support for the families. How is it possible for Canada to have these kinds of conversations with officials in Tehran when relations are sour? If Luciano, you want to take that, and then we'll pass it on to Bessma.
Well, I think it was possible because of political will of both states to do that. Iran is conscious that, of course, they don't have diplomatic relations currently with Canada, but they felt that they needed to do something to reply to what happened. Most of the people who died in that airplane were Iranian and Canadian, so they couldn't they couldn't stop talking to the Canadian government to try to reach an agreement in order to facilitate the investigation or facilitate some kind of compensation for those who died and for those who lost their families. So I think there was a political will there that pushed both governments to do that. The same for Canada. I'm not going to talk about Trudeau. Everybody knows. How. He has much more good image abroad, maybe than in Canada. Probably it can happen this way, but I think that it was necessary to do that, even though the relations are not good, and it was necessary to do that. Other thing is if this conversation reached to some end or not. I mean, if the collaboration between the two governments is producing some result in terms of compensation, in terms of investigation, in terms of providing the necessary documents that the Canadian government and the Ukrainian government are requesting to Iran. This is something that is under discussion, and there is something that we were discussing before. People in the region, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, I can tell you about Argentina and Spain as well, but people, they don't trust their own governments. So they should do an extra effort to show that they are transparent and that they are compliant and they are accountable when these kind of things happen in the middle of already complicated situations, and with the addition of more elements that are adding more distrust from the people. The way in which most of the government in the world, but some specifically, dealt with COVID in terms of information, in terms of transparency, is adding to other chapters in which governments were not transparent and were not accountable, or that the people feel that the governments were not accountable. So I think the Iranian government needed to do an extra effort, and I think at least this conversation is, I think it should be a positive step.
Bessma, Professor Zaccara, speaking about this political will, just how much of an incentive do the Iranians have at this stage, given that already, even prior to the downing of that passenger airline, they were already under economic, political, humanitarian pressure. Do they have an incentive to be at the table right now?
So let me just start off by saying, you know, my university alone, we lost 2 PhD students, 2 beautiful Iranian Canadian students. So much of our university campuses are of the brightest Iranian students searching for a better life because their government has failed them to give them the opportunity that they deserve. The brain drain of Iran is unbelievable. So much respect for the Iranian people and what they've gone through. It really breaks my heart to know that the very brightest, and truly you can go through the list of those who died on that flight, they really were the creme de la creme of everything that you would want to come out of your youth. And so to them to be killed, which at the end of the day was the responsibility of the Iranian government. You can't escape the reality. They should not have let civilian aircraft to go out when they were carrying out military activities right next door. Simply. That said, I don't think, and this is the part that I go back to public trust, had we not had civilians on that plane with ties to Canada, would we have found out anything that we did around that plane? It was only because of Canada's presence there. That's the sad part. The Iranian government would have much preferred to just put this under the rug, pretend that it was just an accident, and you know, that it just spontaneously went up in the sky, blamed perhaps other people. They blamed the Americans. We saw that. At the end of the day, accountability has only come because of a G7, G20 country being on the table pushing for it. And that, I think, at the end of the day, should be Canada's role. Put politics aside for something. Give the victims' families some justice and accountability for what went wrong so that that doesn't happen again. To hold the Iranian government, any government, account to when they have civilian airlines in the space. So I think that's really, really important. Did Canada approach it correctly? I think they had to. They really had to. Forget politics, forget the optics of it. They had to get justice for the families. And I'm very proud of what Canada's been doing. Is it enough? I hope they can keep doing more. I don't really appreciate seeing smiles with Zarif, but it's the reality of trying to get justice for the families. And actually, I'd bite my lip just to see that happen.
I'm afraid it's slowly that time has approached for us to wrap this up. But before we do, I'd really like to give each and every one of our panelists just one final opportunity to drive home the most important point that they've taken from this discussion. If you can wrap it up in 1 minute, we'll start with you, Rothna. A thought to leave us with.
Thank you. I think, COVID-19 it's a pandemic that has really, as I mentioned, exacerbated all of the issues that have pre-existed this pandemic, and has really shown up what governments could be doing and haven't been doing, and really has left us in a position that says, if we do not uphold people's human rights, if we do not provide for the security and safety of everyone, citizens and residents, undocumented workers, whoever they may be, we are all unsafe. And this is really the time to do it all, to sketch it out and to throw away the rule book and start from scratch again, to talk about an alternative vision of society that is rights respecting, that provides for those rights for all, in particular the most vulnerable groups in society, and that would ensure a more stable and more peaceful future going forward as well.
Thank you, Rothna. Dennis Horak, lasting words from you, if we may.
I'd like to go back to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, and that's about Canada's approach to the region as a whole. We have various Middle East strategies that are focused very much on aid and humanitarian assistance or particular transactional issues. What I'd like to see is a much more comprehensive approach, and maybe COVID-19 starts us thinking that way. You know, what is it that we want in the Middle East? What are our interests in particular? Not just how we can help the region, but what do we want in that region? And I think that takes a comprehensive approach. That takes a comprehensive approach to the Gulf. That takes engagement. That takes understanding. That takes re-establishing relations, proper relations with both the Saudis and the Iranians. These aren't diplomatic relations. Are not signs of approval. You can have major differences with a country. Look at Canada and China right now, but still maintain diplomatic relations. And I think we can be a constructive force in the region if we want to be, if we want to engage, if we want to have the political will, but we have to understand what we're trying to do there, what our interests are, and it's not just about aid programs. So.
Thank you very much there, Dennis. Professor Zaccara.
Well, I mean, Rothna is taking all my words. She's very, very good. Actually, I would repeat something I said in one of my interventions, that we need, I mean, we scholars, diplomats, governments, journalists, we need to think in a more holistic way our approaches to security, having in mind that the most important capital that every state has, every nation has, is their own people, and mainly the more vulnerable people that they have been affected much more than anybody else because of the COVID. And the only way that we can learn some lesson from this pandemic, that is not going to be the last one, is, I mean, unfortunately, the way the world is evolving, we will face more pandemics in the future. And if we take the wrong approach, if we securitize the situation in the wrong way, the next pandemic not only will not bring solidarity or empathy, that will create much more conflicts than we saw recently, because the governments will be ready in a defensive way rather than in a more holistic or human way.
Bessma.
Yeah, thank you. You know, that's a great segue to what I would say is that, you know, we talk about security and stability in the Middle East, but there are people living there. You know, they're Middle Easterners. It's a beautiful, rich, wonderful, you know, society and community. And I think as we talk about all of these geopolitical shifting forces and global agendas, I just hope that we always come back to that, because if we lose sight of that, we dehumanize the region, and they've been dehumanized enough. We need to remember that there are talented, predominantly young, highly educated, overall cosmopolitan people in those societies. They deserve better government, but they also deserve us to recognize that they're there.
And on that note, I'm afraid our time has come to an end. I would like to very personally and wholeheartedly thank our wonderful panel. For me, it was a very dynamic and, above all, I think, human discussion that we just had. So thank you, Dennis Horak, Bessma Momani, Rothna Begum, Luciano Zaccara. Thank you all. And I'd like to thank Eunice for inviting me to moderate this discussion from the Institute.